In this video, we're going to go over the basics of the recall step. Recall is a step that will take data from disk and bring it into SoundCheck. Opening data via the memory list will create protected data. On the other hand, a recall step will create sequence data. The main difference is that if SoundCheck is ever closed, protected data is deleted. Using a recall step, we can make sure that we're always pointing to specific data, and that data can be used later in the sequence. Some examples of why we would want to recall data would be a golden unit for comparison, weighting or correction curves, a stored waveform for analysis, or limit curves. We can select different file types to recall. The SoundCheck native format will bring in anything that was saved directly from SoundCheck. Curves are values from a DAT file, results from a .res file, or waveforms from a .wfm file. This is helpful because these formats save metadata. SoundCheck will remember their units, their scaling, if they were created by a stimulus step. We can also bring text from a .txt or a .csv. Because these aren't standardized, we would have to specify what format and what units we're trying to bring in. The last option is to import a wave from a .wav file. We'll look at some of the specifics of a text or wave file in later videos. Once we select the file we want to recall, we can choose which data is brought in. If the single file contains multiple curves, for example, I could specify which ones to bring in, give them custom names, or only recall the last piece of data added to the file. To pick which file we're recalling, we have three different options. We can specify the file path. In this example, we're pointing to the absolute file path on disk, but we could also recall a file path relative to our SoundCheck sequence. Let's open up SoundCheck and take a look. I'll drop in this recall curves template. Over here on the right is where we choose which type of file we're looking to recall. I'll choose waveforms, which is looking for a .wfm file. I have Specify File Path selected, and I can click on this folder icon to open up a Windows dialog. Because I have waveform selected in the recall editor, we're only looking for .wfm files, so we see two options here. I could change this to look at all files. Now I'll change to curves, which is searching for a .dat, and go back to the same data folder. One common use of a recall step would be to apply A, B, or C weighting onto a measurement. So I'll choose this A, B, and C weightings.dat and bring it into SoundCheck. After I chose this, you can see in the recall curve section at the bottom, it automatically read the DAT file and told me which curves were saved here. This will only happen when you specify a file path. If you're using automatic or prompt operator, it won't read the file until you run the sequence, so you have to manually enter in what names you want them to be. And now I want to look in the memory list. I'll go to Setup Memory List here. I have my step set up, but I haven't run it yet, so we see placeholders here in the memory list. It's sequence data, but it hasn't been run yet, so there's an empty circle next to the name. To show you the difference between a recall step and opening data, I'll open that same exact file through this memory list. It shows up in the memory list now with check marks next to it, which means it's protected data. If I look at the protected A weighting curve, you can see there's data there already. If I look at the placeholder curve, it's currently empty. I run the sequence, the recall step executes, and I get my A weighting curve from my recall step. But where the recall step becomes much more powerful than opening data is that, say, I close SoundCheck, and I'll emulate that by just deleting all the data and all the tabs. Both my A weighting curves are gone. But when I run my sequence again, you can see the recalled A weighting curve gets displayed here on this graph. The protected A weighted curve is no longer used in SoundCheck. A recall step will allow that data to be used in a sequence and to remember the configuration of which data is used in each step. Using Specify File Path, let's look at some options of the naming. These boxes here will tell me which curve I'm actually bringing in. Even though there's multiple pieces of data inside this single file, maybe I'm only interested in one. If I only want to use B weighting, I could uncheck A and C weighting, and when I save this step and look in the memory list, I'm only recalling my B weighting curve. I can select or deselect all of them using this button. When I first pointed to the file, it automatically read the name of the curve. If I didn't want to use that name, I could highlight it here and enter my own name for it. Instead of A weighting, I'll call it correction. When I save the step, my A weighting is now called correction. If I point to the file again, it will reread the names of them and put them back. Last only will bring in the most recent piece of data from a saved file. When I select it on this file, it will bring in my C weighting. We can also specify the name here when we're using last only. When I look at it, now it'll show you my C weighting curve. If we want to completely remove everything from the list, we can just click the Clear button. There's a couple options for adding curves back in. I can click on this Add button here, specify what I want to name this curve, and click OK. I'll call this one Recall Curve 1, do it again, call it Recall Curve 2. Or I could enable the checkbox and manually enter a name in. So here for my C weighting, I'll call Recall Curve 3, and what if I looked for something called Recall Curve 4? I know this file I'm using only has 3 pieces of data, so if I run the sequence, it will only fill up recall curves 1 through 3. Recall curve 4 will still have an empty circle. No data was found when it tried to recall it. This could be used as a placeholder if you're expecting to write more data to that file later. Instead of highlighting to change the name, we could click the Rename option here. I'll enter a custom name up here and then say which curve I want to rename. I'll rename Recall Curve 1 to A and Recall Curve 2 to B. Alternatively from this window, I could select New Curve and it would add it down to the bottom of this list. Instead of specifying the file path, you could also prompt the operator. When this step runs, it will open up a dialog through the operating system, and the operator will manually choose which file to recall. One example of this is located in your SoundCheck folder under Sequences, Microphones, Open Loop Microphone. This comes with a PDF on how the sequence runs, but as a quick overview, what we're going to do is play a signal out of our speaker, record it on an external device, in this case I'll use my cell phone, and then transfer that WAV file back into SoundCheck. The way that we can automate taking that file and bringing it back into SoundCheck is using a recall step. And in the case where you want to be running the test multiple times and saving different WAV files, Prompt Operator will allow you to find the file you're looking to analyze. So I'll run the sequence, record on my cell phone, SoundCheck plays the signal out, and after that playback is finished, it's telling me to stop the recording and to transfer the WAV file somewhere I can access it. I did that already, so I'll click Enter, and you can see this dialog pop up. This is from the recall step. Now I'm looking for the WAV file that I transferred from my phone. I downloaded it, so I point to my Downloads folder. I'll select it, and the recall step will use this WAV file in SoundCheck. So let's take a look at the step itself. Over here, what we're interested in is step 6. We can see it's set to Prompt Operator, and in this field where we used to specify the file path, we can point to a base path. This is the directory that the prompt will open in. One thing that I'd like to do is change it to my Downloads folder. So if I just run this step from here, this dialog will open up in my Downloads folder. I'll choose a different file that I already recorded and downloaded, and you can see I do analysis on that new WAV file. Another option for the file path is automatic. This will create a set of criteria for SoundCheck to use to find the file to be recalled. This is really helpful when used in conjunction with autosave steps, because the editor construction here at the bottom is exactly the same. We'll also use an example sequence to take a look at this one. In SoundCheck, Sequences, How-To Examples, there's a sequence called Limits in Reference to Standard. We'll open this up, and again it comes with a PDF that explains how the sequence works. This sequence will allow us to measure a golden unit, offset that frequency response to create limits, and then compare a device under test with that golden unit to see how different they are. When I first run the sequence, it asks if I want to measure my standard unit. I can select no if I already measured it, but I'm going to select yes. My golden unit is attached, I run the sequence, and here's my reference standard. It now tells me to connect my device under test. I'll do that and press enter. That's the only unit I have, so I'll say no to test another unit and look at the displays. The red lines here are the limits based on our golden unit. It took that first fundamental we measured, offset it by plus and minus 2 dB, and now compares a device under test to it. Let's look at the sequence to see how this was configured. The first 5 steps in the sequence are measuring our golden unit. Where the recall step comes into play is at step 8, directly after an autosave step. If we look at this autosave step, we can see it's saving in the default folder path a new file with a user-defined name. That defined name is reference standard. Whenever we actually measure our new golden unit, it will autosave that frequency response called reference standard. In the recall step, the file path is set to automatic. The base path is our default SoundCheck data, which is the same as the autosave step, and it's also looking to recall in a curve with a user-defined name of reference standard. When that's found, it recalls only the last curve in that file and puts it in the memory list called reference standard. This doesn't even have to be in the same sequence. We could have one sequence that's run at the beginning of the day to create our golden unit, and then every sequence after that will just recall in that reference standard. Because it's set to last only, we could have a history saved of the golden units and only care about the most recently calculated curve. One other thing we could do would be add different things to the autosave step and then apply those to the recall step. I'm going to change this separator to none because that's what's in the recall step, and I'll add on the date after the reference standard. In the recall step, I'll then add the date here as well. If I run the sequence, it's going to ask me if I want to measure my standard unit. I already did that by manually applying the autosave step, so I'll select no. This uses a jump on logic step to go right to the recall, bring in that file we just looked at, and apply those as the limits. This type of configuration would help to verify that I did run my golden unit test today. Because the recall is only looking for something with today's date, if I ran my golden unit to find the limits out yesterday, it wouldn't find the recall file and fail.